Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I want to take a look at the Unreal Engine framework. There's already a great tutorial on the developer community at the Epic Games forums that you can see under the Begin Play series, and I'm going to link this URL inside of the description for the video, but the schematic here is what I want to talk about. If you download the schematic, it's going to get you a great view of an overview of the different components and systems inside of Unreal. Now this isn't comprehensive of all the things, but these are some of the main systems that lead you to building your core gameplay. And I want to talk about these and look in Engine to see where you would interact with some of these systems. So by default, you have the project settings are going to define what is going to be used by your game when it gets published, when you build it. The project and the build are not the same thing, of course. So we want to make sure that we understand that when we launch the game after it's been built, it's going to create a game instance. The game instance is what's generated by the .exe file that is executed by the user. And if there aren't the associated files that go along with it, then it won't run anything. Once the game is loaded, it's going to have a set of configurations that are determined in the project settings about what level it loads first. Once a level gets loaded, it'll open that level's game mode. The game mode defines things like what the character is, what their inputs are, how they can interact with the systems, and what the objective is for the current situation. This means that we can use the same level with different game modes and have completely different experiences. So if I were to look at this and zoom out a little bit, you can see that the game mode can articulate what the player is. The player is going to be split up into two entities. There's the player representation in the world, the avatar, typically represented by a pawn, and then the player's input or brain, the controller. The controller will control things like audio, camera, managing input, things like that. And then the pawn can be used to manifest a representation of the player's control in the world. That can be an RTS game that would be, being allowed to click on certain objects and entities and tell them where to go. And in a first-person or third-person game, it would be maybe controlling the physical character of their actions. So when you think about a pawn is just a controllable entity inside of the world. So when you think about the game mode, when it defines what the pawn is, you could have multiple character types, and then that is determined by the game mode, which is loaded by the level. And so the sequence of things that goes on here, you can see that there's a level of continuity you need to consider. For example, if you have a game where a player can die, then you want to respawn the character. Well, if you had information about that character, for instance, they collected some secret collectible that's going to count towards a long-term meta achievement, well, you probably want to be able to store that in a place that persists longer than the pawn that gets killed by falling into a fire pit. So if you have that information, move it from the pawn to something more persistent, like the controller. If the controller is going to be loaded in and out when the player restarts because you're loading the level again, but getting a new instance of the game mode, a new instance of the player controller, then you could pass that information up to something like the game instance, or you could just instantaneously save that out to external data and then load that as needed. But you need to think about those things as you go to construct your game. And if you can see the connectivity of how the game is built, then that'll help you conceive how you should structure your systems and mechanics that are going to build your game. In addition to the game mode choosing the player, it's also defining the rules for the game. So if you're going to have things that are going to be objectives for players to accomplish, you might want to pass those off to the game state to define enemies killed, items collected, laps run, things like that for the game state. The player state is going to control information that's related to the specific player, their progress in a particular mission, their ammo, their health, their location, their telemetry, things like that. That'll be identified in the player state. Typically meant to be fairly lightweight, but these things are crucial for being able to replicate information across the network. You'll notice these replication nodes sent out here. This is saying that these things are designed inherently to be propagated out across the network. So the information that you pass out there lets everyone stay on the same page without having to code the entire network system yourself. You can also have characters that are inside the world that are not controlled by the player. So if the controller and the input isn't what you're intending to use, then you can check out having the AI behavior system, which has a very robust representation of different systems. The AI system relies on the navigation system to determine where is a viable place to go and how it maneuvers through the world, but also it has a series of instructions, logic, considerations, conditionals, and resources that will allow it to make decisions on where to go and what to do when it arrives. And then we have the idea of the HUD. That's also a system that's loaded and defined by the game mode. The HUD is a central place for managing information about what's displayed onto the player's screen, but it isn't the only place to do that. It's just a place that's convenient with a few utilities to help in the implementation. So when you go to consider that these systems are available inside of Unreal, the question then becomes, how do I access these? Well, going back to Unreal, if you look at the project settings, we come to Edit and Project Settings. Under maps and modes, this is going to be where you define most of these things. The default game mode, meaning the mode that is attached to any level that's loaded, unless that level has a specific game mode attached to it, is going to be the one that dictates how players interact with the space. Typically, if you have a single player linear campaign, you would have one game mode for the front menu, but your default game mode would be the game mode that you get when you play the game using the mechanics and systems and encounters that you would have during gameplay, the loop the player is supposed to experience. So when we think about the default maps and modes here, this is an important thing to consider. What is the most common experience the player is going to have? Are they always going to have a HUD, or do you default to cinematic experiences and load a different player controller after the fact? So just be mindful of what these things are and how you can interact with them. There's also the context of the game instance. We want to consider that the game instance can be loaded. You could have potentially different instances that would load for different versions of the game. Not instances, game instance. The game instance is under the class for game instance here. You can define that, and if you don't want to create the class separately through the content browser, you can click plus to most of these things here and modify them and generate them right there. If I come down to the maps and modes, I can create a new game mode. I can create a new one of each of these just by clicking the plus icon. An important consideration, again, if we go back to the schematic, right? Inside of the schematic, we have the level instance, and that loads a level first. This setting right here in the default maps, the editor startup and the game default map, these are the ways that the system knows which level to load first, so which game mode and how the player is going to interact first. So when you have the game default map, that's going to go to whatever map is going to dictate the player's entry experience, typically a menu or a splash screen. So with these things established, there's a number of other systems you can get back to inside of Unreal Engine. Then when we look at these, we want to consider that each one of these systems is represented by code. Now, you don't need C++ to be able to utilize these things, but it definitely helps to be able to understand C++ if you want to extend them in ways that goes beyond what Blueprints affords you. So when I right-click here and I say Blueprint Class, there's a list of some default actors here. These are the more common used ones. It says common right here, right? There's not the extensive default exclusive ones that you should use, but more often than not, if you're going to create a new blueprint, it's going to be an actor, a character, or a component. When you think about the hierarchy of classes, because Unreal is a very object-oriented system, it has every object that starts off as a U object. So in C++, you'll see the designator U object. A U object as their own specific class that kind of manages its own memory. It registers itself with the project and the instance, and it has a certain level of network awareness as you go to build other content. And then from the object, there's U actor, or what's a actor is the C++ class, and so a actor is just a particular object that has a transform in it. That means it exists in the world. It's a physical thing. And then from actor, we have the ability to create things like pawns. Pawns are controllable actors, and so controllable actors can be controlled by AI or the player, so a player controller or an AI controller. And a character is a more specific kind of pawn that is meant to have terrestrial movement. It's a controllable character that has gravity and physics, collision capsules, has some awareness of like level propagation and spawning and movement systems built into it. And so a character is a more robust pawn that represents a fairly common set of utilities for how to interact in the world. The player controller, of course, is going to tell you how to direct input to the character. You can control a character directly by managing input there, but typically you want the controller to be the area where you run input through and then delegate that instruction to the character from the controller. We have the game mode base. You're going to create several game modes on your own. The game mode is going to control things like where the player spawns, what their objectives are, when the match ends, things like that. And then you have actor components. These can be attached to any actor. These have a non-physical representation, so they get attached to something and they perform some function. So it is an actor, right? But it's not in the world because it gets attached to an actor, which is in the world. And then you would have a scene component, and scene components have a physicality to them. So if you attach a scene component to something, then it exists at a specific space inside of whatever it is that you've attached it to. So if I attach a scene component to a level, that scene component has to live somewhere. If I attach a scene component to a character, it has a relationship positionally to where the character is. Now, these aren't the only options. Again, we can expand out to all classes, and you can see down here there's a number to go through. It says 894 total items. It would be unreasonable to go through all these because some of these are redundant, some of these are extremely nuanced or myopic in their application, but it's good to know that there's a number of things out here. For example, if you wanted to set up like an AI controller, you have AI controller as one of the classes. It's not one of the default classes because not everyone uses AI in their systems. So if you want to do that, you'll have to find that here. So being mindful of the framework, how to configure it, how to interact with it, how to generate the different elements, it's an important component that lets you keep building.